Olá, espero que vocês tenham gostado do conteúdo do Campinas Consciente, o evento que marca o lançamento do chapter regional em Campinas do Capitalismo Consciente Brasil. Eu sou o Luiz Eduardo Drouet, Managing Partner da Share RH e um dos líderes da fundação desse chapter aqui em Campinas. Gostaria de agradecer muito a audiência de vocês e apresentar essa palestra especial de encerramento, né, que marca um encontro aí entre os participantes da Share Conference 2020 com os participantes do evento Campinas Consciente. Então, o Christopher Dreisbach, ele que é diretor do programa de liderança organizacional da Hopkins University, gravou esse conteúdo especial focado em liderança virtuosa, em parceria aí com a participação do Francisco Homem de Mello, ele que é CEO da Culture Rocks. Então, espero que vocês gostem desse conteúdo e até o próximo evento do Capitalismo Consciente Brasil no Chapter em Campinas.
Welcome everybody. We're here at another important keynote of the Share Conference 2020. And today we have what I learned is Reverend Dr. Christopher Dreisbach. Chris, as we're gonna know in a bit, is both a master and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and writer of many books with very wide-spanning interests, I must say. I was impressed by that. And spanning from logic to law and ethics, religion, which reminded me, funnily enough, that I was just this weekend, I rented a place close to home to spend a weekend, and it clearly, the owners were Jewish, and there was a little library over there, and I caught, one of the books caught my eye, and I ended up reading it, and it was by a rabbi called Harold Kushner, and the title is Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, and it resonated with me when I saw your book, which is, God doesn't have to be that somber or something to that tone, which sounded to the same direction. But anyway, it's, I love that stuff. So, but today, Chris is the director of the master's program in organizational leadership or leadership at Johns Hopkins. So a fruit of Johns Hopkins, a total alma mater, if I may. And he's going to talk to us about virtuous leadership, which is, I hadn't made that connection, but a very interesting subject. I'm eager to listen to your talk. And then afterwards, we're going to do a short Q&A with some questions that were posed by the audience and some that will arise during your talk. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining us. It's a big pleasure and a big privilege for us. And well, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Francisco. I'm grateful for your kind invitation and your kind introduction, both. And what I wanted to do today was take the conversation about leadership in a slightly different direction than it seems to go. And that is to emphasize the moral implications of leadership and argue that it's those implications that distinguish leadership from things that sometimes are confused with it. I thought I would begin with a definition of leadership that is a bit unconventional, though it's one I've used a lot and seem to have gotten some distance out of. The problem of definition, of course, is where to start. Do we start with some formula and then try to stick to that formula as closely as we can. And this would be a kind of deductive attempt to define leadership. Or do we start with examples of leadership and build up from there? And that would be more inductive. So that, for example, in the United States, just about everybody familiar with United States history would agree that Abraham Lincoln was a leader. And the question then would be, okay, so what makes him a leader? What would have to be missing from him for him not to have been a leader? So this can go, we can attempt this definition in either of two ways. And what I'm going to do is propose the first way as a working definition. It's a definition that I think will work if we tried to start in the other direction by taking specific examples and then extracting from those examples a definition. I think we would arrive at the same point. So to begin, I'd like to suggest that a leader is someone who moves his followers or her followers to a better situation than they would have been in otherwise. Now, this is a slightly different definition from a standard one, which is simply that a leader is anybody who influences others. But I think that's too broad a definition because there are all kinds of ways to influence people. And not all of those are ways that look like leadership. And so here, I would like to, this is another way we can define something, is by what it's not. And so if indeed a leader is someone who moves followers to a better situation than they would have been otherwise, I would like to contrast a leader in the first place with a manager. And so I would say, using a nautical metaphor, that a manager is somebody who keeps a boat or a ship on course, but a leader is somebody who sets that course. And in doing so, the leader is really responsible for deciding how the followers are going to move forward and get to a better place. Whereas the manager's task is simply to make sure that whatever course has been set is maintained. I'd also like to contrast a leader with a bully or a tyrant. Back in 1975, a group of scholars of leadership held a conference, and I think it was sponsored by the University of Maryland, which asked the question, was Hitler a leader? And the conclusion was no. I mean, as much as he was able to achieve what he wanted to achieve, and as much as he was able to influence a lot of people, the answer was that he didn't lead people in some forward and promising direction. He basically just pushed people around and got them to do what he wanted them to do. And that's not leadership, that's bullying, or that's tyranny. It's in that contrast especially that I want to suggest in a moment that if indeed a leader's task is to move followers to a better situation than they were otherwise, then that implies a moral duty, which in turn implies virtue. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but one more contrast. So one contrast was with a manager. And managers can be perfectly decent moral people, but they just have a different responsibility than a leader does. Another contrast was with the bully or the tyrant. And in that case, the bully or tyrant tends to be more self-interested than interested in the forward progress of the follower. And also frequently what happens with a bully or a tyrant is the followers are worse off than they would have been otherwise. And then the final contrast would be with a person who is a leader in name or title only. But either they don't have an ability to advance their followers, or they simply have no interest in advancing their followers. So if one accepts that definition of leadership as someone who moves followers to a better place or a better situation than they would have been otherwise, and one accepts the contrasts between a leader on the one hand and a manager on the other, between a leader on the one hand and a bully or tyrant on the other, between a leader on the one hand and someone who's a leader in name or title only, then we see in that definition of leadership a moral responsibility, a duty. Now, we could spend hours talking about different theories of ethics and different theories of duty, but for my purposes, a very old and useful definition is virtue. Virtue theory. This goes back to Aristotle, at least. Now, he didn't invent this theory, but he popularized it, and he popularized it in a way that has made it useful and practical for about 2,400 years. And I want to argue that successful leadership is virtuous leadership, that you can't have one without the other. And key to this whole argument is a definition of virtue that goes like this: the ability habitually to know the good and to do the good. Okay, so virtue is the ability habitually to know the good and do the good. Now that word habitual is key because it suggests that a morally good person is someone who can be counted on to be morally good, who is in the habit of being morally good. And incidentally, the word habit in Greek is ethos, and it's from that word that English gets the word ethical. It's also the case that in Latin, the word, the corresponding word is mores, M-O-R-E-S, which also means habit. And it's from mores that English gets the words moral and morality. So that this word habit, it turns out, is the essence of ethics and morality. So we're really getting at the heart of ethics when we use this word habitual. So again, virtue is the ability habitually to know the good and to do the good. So that what I want to argue is a leader, as opposed to any of the other contrasts that I threw at you a minute ago. A leader is somebody who habitually knows the good and does the good. Both. Now, that's a pretty vague definition of good and virtue. So we need something a little more practical. And Aristotle, who was always about the practical, goes further with this and suggests that for something to be good at its best is to be perfect. And to be perfect means there's neither too little of it, nor is there too much of it. So perfect must be a mean between two extremes, an extreme of too little or deficiency, and extreme of too much or excess. And what we get now then is the famous Aristotelian golden mean. I don't think Aristotle ever used the term golden. He used the word mean all the time. But history has come to call this the golden mean. And so the leader must be someone who habitually is able to find the mean between extremes whenever that's necessary. So we can count on the leader habitually never to be excessive and never to be deficient. Now, of course, this is a matter of degree because we are human. And so we will, on occasion, no matter how virtuous we are, tend toward the excessive or tend toward the deficient. But at least a leader is somebody we can count on routinely and habitually finding that mean and knowing where that mean is and getting us there. Now, even that is a bit vague. So the definition, the original definition of virtue is quite vague. The ability to habitually know the good and do the good. To suggest that the good is the mean between extremes is a little less vague. And it reminds us that we have we have a tendency as humans to aim for that mean. Aristotle himself described it as a bullseye, and much as a very good archer can find that bullseye and hit it routinely, a morally good person is somebody who knows the moral bullseye and hits that bullseye routinely. But if we stop there, I think we would have, we'd be incomplete in our attempt to describe the virtuous leader. what we need are some real bullseyes, I guess is the way to put it. And what Aristotle offers there is the so-called cardinal virtues. This is a set of 4 specific virtues, which the ancient Greeks believed were a sufficient set of 4, that if one could make these 4 virtues habitual, then one was virtuous by all accounts. And so I'd like to invoke these virtues as part of what I think is important to virtuous leadership. The first is courage. And courage for Aristotle was the mean between cowardice and foolhardiness or recklessness. And so I would argue that the virtuous leader is somebody who habitually shows courage and acts courageously. And that means, again, that the leader is not a coward, nor, though, is the leader reckless. And so certainly in American movies, we often celebrate the reckless. It's not someone who's merely courageous. It's someone who goes overboard. One example, I suppose, and I would never put this out there as an example of leadership, but I would put it out there as an example of recklessness, is the Dirty Harry movies with Clint Eastwood, where he plays a police officer who frequently goes way past what counts as mere courage and just acts recklessly or foolhardily. Well, a leader, it goes to neither extreme. A leader avoids cowardice on the one hand, but a leader also avoids foolhardiness or recklessness on the other, and in so doing, demonstrates courage habitually. The second of the 4 cardinal virtues is justice. Now, here again, we could spend a whole conference on the question of what justice is, but a useful definition is giving somebody exactly what that person deserves, no more and no less. And so a deficiency of justice would be giving somebody less than that person deserves. In criminal justice, an example would be slapping a serial killer on the wrist and sending him home and saying, don't do that again. Right? That's not enough justice. On the other hand, executing a shoplifter would be excessive. And I know those are examples in criminal justice. I'm sure we could come up easily with examples in other walks of life. And so what a leader understands is what a person is due, and then how to give that person his or her due. So in a corporate environment, for example, the leader will understand whether somebody has earned a reward or whether somebody needs, perhaps punishment's too strong a word sometimes, but whether a person needs correcting. And then we'll know how to do it and do it properly. So now we've got 2 of the cardinal virtues, courage and justice. A third of the cardinal virtues is temperance. And while that is often associated with food and drink, eating temperately, drinking temperately, a broader definition would be that temperance is the proper use of any available resource. And an example, and using food and drink as examples, a deficiency might be, let's say, anorexia, where a person doesn't eat enough. And an excess would be gluttony, where a person eats too much. And again, food and drink are such easily understood examples of temperance. But another example might be, one of my daughters is an emergency medical technician, or was. And that meant she often was on an ambulance and answering ambulance calls. And she would give me the examples of somebody who called for an ambulance when they really just needed a taxi cab. Well, that's excessive use of an available resource, right? On the other hand, there were times where somebody was very sick and should have called an ambulance, but waited a very long time before they called. And when she would ask why, they'd say, well, you have more important things to do than worry about me. And she would, and she'd say, no, that's what we do. We are here to help you. That would be a deficient use of an available resource. And so I would argue that a leader understands that. A leader knows what resources are available And then we'll make sure to use those resources as fully as is appropriate, but not overuse that resource. And then finally, of the 4 cardinal virtues is prudence, or practical wisdom. This is the mean between acting on insufficient knowledge, leaping before you look, for example, and which would be the deficiency, or having all of the knowledge you need to act, but failing to act anyway, which would be excessively prudent. And so we're at this point where I've offered really 2 definitions, and I've tried to bring these 2 definitions together. So the first definition was of leadership generally, and that is of someone who moves followers to a better situation than they would have been otherwise. And given the moral implications of that definition, that a leader a leader has a duty to move the followers to a better situation than they were, then I've proposed that the moral theory that best applies there is virtue theory, Aristotle's virtue theory. And so I'm making the claim, and I realize it's controversial, that successful leadership is virtuous leadership. And that the virtuous leader is somebody who habitually knows the good and does the good. And that doing the good means being able to find that mean between the extremes of doing too little and doing too much. Recognizing that you can't always count on hitting the bullseye. Sometimes you have to settle for coming close enough. And then having at the ready a checklist of the 4 cardinal virtues, so that if there's some question about whether one has acted virtuously, one can ask, did the person act courageously, justly, temperately, and prudently? Now, that's my argument that I'm putting forth, and recognizing that not everybody is going to agree with it. And I fully expect challenges on both the very definition of leadership and the argument that one must be virtuous to be a leader. And so I'd really like just to make a couple of more comments. And the first is that while virtue is a necessary condition of leadership, it's not a sufficient condition. You can find many virtuous people who would nevertheless make pretty bad leaders, right? Or maybe bad leaders is an unfair word. They'd be non-leaders. I mean, there's a difference between bad leadership and non-leadership. Bad leadership is setting out to be a leader and failing at it. Non-leadership is being in a position where you weren't called upon to be a leader in the first place. And so I think there are children who are virtuous, who tend to be courageous, just, temperate, and prudent, but it would be silly to call them leaders. So while I am pushing virtue as a necessary condition of leadership, I don't mean to suggest that it's sufficient. There are other things required for leadership besides that. And perhaps some of this will emerge in the conversation we're about to have. But I would suggest a few of those features just for the sake of argument. So, for example, it seems to me that in addition to being virtuous, a leader has to be adaptive. A leader has to be transformative. A leader has to have a strong sense of history. A leader has to have a sense of hope, among other features. So while I'm suggesting, for the purposes of our conversation and even the purposes of this conference, that virtue is a necessary condition of leadership, I don't want to come across as suggesting that it's enough. Obviously, a leader needs much more than that, and I expect many of your speakers will have all kinds of other important ingredients to add to that mix. And I think that's pretty much what I hope to say. And now I leave it to you to tell me where I've gone wrong or to tell me what you agree with.
Amazing. That's a very interesting take that I had never experienced before. So I have a few questions. Yes, I don't intend, but intend is not the right word. I don't suppose I'll be able to poke holes. You're the specialist here, but it was interesting because you've written about logic. You mentioned deductive logic, inductive logic, and what I was thinking when you were navigating through the definitions was that, when you said, leadership is habitually doing good and knowing good, and I was thinking, I assume all leaders are virtuous, but not all virtuous people are leaders, and you ended clarifying that to me. So that was probably the biggest question or probing I was willing to do to your theory.
Okay.
But anyway, very good stuff. My first question to you is, what if we presume that good leaders or leaders are virtuous, where does the culture of the company or the organization come into play? And I think in many ways, when we think about what are the desired competencies of most people in work settings, to me, they tend to be pretty similar independently of the company nowadays, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm inclined to say that, all leaders must be virtuous, regardless of where they work or of which setting they are in. But when we talk about culture, we always talk about differentiating organizations and about how cultures have to be different and how cultures have to provoke a sense of deep belonging in some people and of maybe even repulsion in others, right? Yesterday, the book by Reed Hastings from Netflix came out, and Netflix is known for talking about their own culture in a way that, some people say, well, I'd love to work there, and some people say, I hate to work there. So what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I first of all, I'm grateful for you bringing up corporate culture, because a leader doesn't operate within a vacuum. And so corporate culture is really the milieu for the leader to lead. There are a couple of thoughts. One is historical, and that is when you look at theories of leadership through time, we have progressed. When I say we who care about studying leadership and defining it, we have progressed from the so-called great man theory of leadership. The idea was that a very powerful person steps into the role and all of the followers just follow. They just do what the leader does and the leader says, and that it was up to the leader to establish the culture. And often it was a cult of personality that was the culture. But over time, corporations discovered how much more productive they could be if the followers had some input, and the followers were able to offer their wisdom and suggest certain goals of their own that were compatible with the corporation. And you might use the term buy-in, for example, or something like that, that by giving the followers more buy-in and more of a sense of purpose, the whole corporation functioned better. And so what we've discovered certainly over time is that the best corporate cultures tend to be those whose vision, mission, and goals are both transparent to everybody and desirable to everybody, so that we end up in a corporation with a corporate culture where everybody is a potential leader and everybody is free to contribute to the leader's effort. The Roman Catholic Church, back during the Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, made much of an idea of subsidiarity. It's a wonderful term, and I think it fits in leadership well. And the idea of subsidiarity is wisdom from the grassroots up. And so the Catholic Church realized after 2,000 years that there was a lot of wisdom in the ordinary people in the church. And that instead of merely telling people what they should do, why not ask them what they think they should do and what they think the church itself should do? And so since Vatican II in the mid-1960s, the more progressive members of the Roman Catholic Church have promoted this idea that there's a lot of wisdom at the grassroots. And we ought to tap that, and we ought to give people a chance. And I don't mean to get too religious here, but another way we've put that in my church, which is the Episcopal Church, is that everybody probably has a ministry in them. Doesn't mean everybody's ordained, everybody's going to be a priest, but everybody has a ministry. Everybody has something they're capable of doing and they want to do for the good of others. So that I think in a corporate culture that's going to succeed today, you're going to find a commitment to tapping that in everybody, at least making it possible. I think some people just want to show up for work, put in their 8 or 10 hours and go home. Just leave me alone. Okay, fine. That's fine. As long as you do your job, that's fine. But it seems to me the ones who really thrive in their work are those who feel like they make a difference and that they are part of the movement forward of the organization. So that in a healthy corporate culture, as I understand it, you will have the person who has the title leader, like the CEO of the company. But this person will be deeply committed to giving everybody in the corporation a chance to find their own leadership abilities and then be able to put those to proper use. So not everybody's qualified to be a CEO. We know that. But everybody, if given the chance, has a good idea. And everybody, if given the chance, has a story to tell. And we can learn from those stories about how to make things better. And so that I would hope, and perhaps I'm anticipating another question of yours, I would hope that the person who has the title of leader, such as the CEO, would model that and say both by word and by action, I'm committed to helping you find the leader in yourself so that we can combine our efforts and make this a better corporation. But that, of course, includes constantly reminding each other of the vision of the corporation, of the mission, of the goals. And if a corporation lacks that, then it's really kind of sailing without a chart, right? Yeah, without direction. Thank you. And then that means also the corporations being committed to giving those opportunities to everybody in the corporation, professional development, and discovering that leader within themselves. maybe that's enough of an answer. I might have over-answered your question.
No, that's amazing. It dovetails nicely into another thing that I was thinking here, which is when we talk about virtue, there is a sense, or when we talk about these qualities like justice, temperance, prudence, even goodness, that they sound innate in that, age-old debate between, are you born with it, can you develop it? Do you think these virtues are potentially, I don't know if that's a proper word, but developable in people?
Yes. The quick answer is yes. And here I find useful the image of a gyroscope. A common phrase is moral compass. But I think that's, if one's looking for a mechanical metaphor in talking about ethics, I like the metaphor of a gyroscope better than a compass. To be sure, there are human beings, God bless them, who lack a moral conscience. So a sociopath, a psychopath, somebody who has suffered a grave brain injury to the parts of the brain that deal with morality. Okay, they won't fit into what I'm about to say. But I think the rest of us are born with a gyroscope that is constantly trying to find its equilibrium. I just think this is natural. It's probably evolutionary. And I don't mean to limit this to morality, so that we are inclined to avoid stuff that's too cold, and we're inclined to avoid stuff that's too hot. Mm-hmm. And we're inclined, when we're listening, we're inclined to avoid noises that are too soft, and we're inclined to avoid noises that are too loud. And it just seems that we've come into this world with a device in us that is constantly seeking equilibrium, and then is reminding us all the time of when we're off equilibrium. In Eastern medicine, for example, health is about balance. We tend in Western medicine to try to remove the specific problem, right? Get rid of the specific symptom. But in Eastern medicine, the task is always to cast a balance, so that in acupuncture, for example, in any given problem, there's either too much energy directed to that problem or too little. And so the acupuncturist will reset the energy levels so that there's an equilibrium. When you step into a shower, if the water's too hot, you just turn it down. You turn down the temperature. If it's too cold, you turn it up. You'll notice too, and this is a side note, that often it doesn't take very much to make the adjustment. Right? If you step into the shower and it's burning your skin, you don't rip out the shower and start over again. You just turn the knob down a little bit, right? Or if you get into your car and turn on your car radio and the volume is blowing out your eardrums, you don't sell the car. You just turn the radio dial down a little bit. So I believe that for anybody capable of moral agency, we have that moral gyroscope that is constantly trying to maintain equilibrium. And much of the ability to maintain that equilibrium is learned. So I don't think we're born a blank slate, as some have suggested. I think nature has given us all kinds of equipment to navigate through life and at least survive, if not thrive. But we need to be taught about that equipment, and we need to be taught about how to keep that equipment in good shape. And so to that extent, I do think it's developable, which is a neat word. I hadn't thought of that word before. But I do think virtue can be developed, yes. Much of that is by calling to people's attention what resources they have, and then giving them plenty of opportunity to practice. The theory only gets you so far. And so when I do 1 and 2 day workshops, for example, on ethics and law enforcement, I do several of those a year. The theory is a very, very small part of our day, because I'm assuming they already have the ability to be ethical, and that 9 times out of 10, they're gonna know the right thing to do. So they don't need some Hopkins professor to come in and wag a finger at them and say, thou shalt and thou shalt not. But what I can do is remind them, first of all, that every so often there are very difficult moral cases where they're caught off guard. They're not sure what to do next. And then show them that there are actually tools available to help them through those tough cases, and then give them the tough cases. And so we spend the better part of our time practicing. Now here's the tough case, and let's talk about this. And at first, it's so difficult that we can't agree on what the solution, but by the time we're finished, we've pretty much seen how this can be fixed. And that's one reason I think experience is such a useful teacher. And it's only part of good leadership, but an important part. So yes, I think it's developable.
It's amazing and curious. Well, it's an interesting coincidence that you do these workshops in such a polarizing time in terms of police in the U.S. and so on.
Yes.
You have a tough job.
Yes.
I've been following all of that through a distance, but it's sad that things, the discussion is, to me at least, so derailed in terms of what officers are doing and so on. I understood that in these workshops, what you do is you try to take them to more sophisticated use cases of virtue, for example.
Yes.
And try to fine-tune their notion of what's good or bad, and I think that is very applicable to the corporate setting.
I agree.
Yeah, because we're always thinking in exceptions and in tough situations, and it's obvious that we shouldn't punch a colleague in the face or steal from the company or something like that, or buy a first-class ticket to go to a meeting during times of crisis. And so my question would be, are there any tools that you share with these officers that may be good tools for us to have in our minds for our corporate day-to-day, some snippet that we could, take as a practical homework from you?
Yes. Now, but my first answer is going to be my first answer, which is virtue. But what I argue is that for anybody facing a moral conundrum, there is at the ready a set of tools, and it's really a very small set. But that's the good news. We can make ethics very complicated. I once saw a cartoon. The caption was, "I'm a philosopher. I can make a problem out of any solution." and I agree that we have that ability, but it doesn't really pay any dividends. And so it turns out that ethics is actually fairly simple if one is willing to start there. And so in that toolbox, I think virtue is kind of the tool-o-matic, but there's the tool of consequences, for example. So another theory of ethics is that one ought to assess the morality of an action by its consequences. And that's an important tool. One ought to take very seriously the consequences. Are these consequences beneficial or are they harmful? I mean, it seems like a pretty basic question. And then also a sense of duty. right? And so another theory of ethics, deontology, is the idea that we ought always to act from duty. If this were a talk about ethics itself, I'd go into some detail about the strengths and weaknesses of those. But what I would say is that that moral toolbox is always at the ready. And the more one understands the usefulness of those tools and the limits of the usefulness of those tools, the more one is ready to put those tools to good use. The big difference between virtue as a tool in the moral toolbox and consequences and duties is that virtue is primarily about the character of the person, whereas the other tools are more about what that person is doing. And so I guess another thing to say about what I'm pushing today is how important the character of the leader is. It's not enough merely to, as you might do, say in The Wizard of Oz, put a pin on you that says leader and boom, you're a leader. It involves character. And so the practical comment I would make, if somebody accepts my definition of leadership and somebody accepts that within that definition is a responsibility to be virtuous, is to study it and take opportunities to practice it. Have kind of moral drills when you can, for example. And I've actually worked with some companies where I suggested this. Now, it's interesting. I haven't always kept up with them to see whether they carried it out. But as I walked out the door, they said, oh, this is a neat idea. And that was find time to bring people together and put before them either a real moral problem and help them solve it, or a hypothetical, just to kind of help them develop their moral muscle. Right? So I teach a course in business ethics in the summer, and most of my students in that course are from mainland China. And so it's a very interesting mix of cultures, economic theories, right? So I'm bringing this American free market, it's kind of every man for himself, and they're bringing this communist economic system where we ought all to be acting for the good of the community. From there, what do we do with moral problems? What do we do with the fact that I know that my best friend who got me this job is cheating on her timesheet, but she's figured out how to do it without getting caught? Well, to whom is my first loyalty? Is it to my friend who got me the job, or is it to the company that hired me? And what are the consequences if I turn her in, if I tell on her? And how should I tell on her? Should I do it anonymously, or should I be bold and just walk right in there and
That's a tough one.
Yeah. And so and we spend the summer with cases like this and just talking back and forth, and every time I've done this for 10 years now, and I've probably over those 10 years had easily 600 to 900 students, because I get 30 students to a class and I do several sections, probably more than 900 students. And every single summer I learn something. That either I learn a new problem that I'd never thought of before that they've encountered, or I learn a new way of looking at a problem. And so for even the busiest corporations, it seems to me they could take time out to have these moral drills. And they can be perishable skills as well. So having done this just once is never enough. You need to bring people back periodically and say, okay, let's kind of refresh ourselves and remind ourselves. And what that does is it heightens one's sensitivity to these issues. And remember now, the key to virtue theory is habit. And so what one wants to do is get people in the habit of thinking this way. And per your earlier question about developability, I love that word. I think it would make a great book. We assume that everybody is showing up with the basic ability to do this. So what we need to do to develop it is to introduce them to the ability and then to give them plenty of opportunity to exercise.
Perfect.
That would be my answer.
Amazing. I'm gonna pose a last question. I think we're almost due here,
Okay.
so I don't want to take more of your time than we're budgeted for. My last question is, we in business, the more practitioner side, I am more and more amazed each day by how little we know and we study of the basics of what we're dealing with.
Yes.
For example, we at Culture Rocks, one of the things we offer our customers is goal management software, right? And goals nowadays have this flavor called OKRs, which is basically somebody in Silicon Valley mostly ignored everything that was ever written about managing through goals and set to discover how they should be done. And when I read, Peter Drucker or George Odiorn from the 50s, I actually bought like 5 secondhand books from Amazon this past week. It's all there. And or it's a lot of it is there. Now, my question to you is, if we want to understand leadership better, and we don't want to just go and buy the latest, I don't know, Adam Grant book, try to read like this fundamental stuff, what are the fundamental readings about leadership and leadership in an organizational setting that people should tackle, to get the basics right?
Well, one text that I found useful, which does a lot of the work for you, is a book by Peter Northouse called Leadership. I think it's in its 8th edition. And it's a sort of like the Bible is supposed to be a library of books. Peter Northouse's book is a library of books. He walks you through the history of the idea of leadership. Along the way, he gives you all of the various tests that are available for testing your own leadership skills, and he also gives you a wonderful bibliography. And I don't get any money for this advertisement. I want you to know that. I'm just so impressed by that one book that if I were a corporate leader trying to get my subordinates interested in this, I would buy that book for all of them. And then I would create opportunities to bring them together. Maybe a weekend retreat, for example, in a nice place. I know with COVID that's tricky, but just maybe twice a year or 4 times a year, have a retreat where we just dive into a piece of that, and we take a look at the various theories of leadership, each of which, of course, has its gurus, and all the way. The current flavor is adaptive leadership, and what you find if you're willing to do
the Ken Blanchard stream.
Yeah, that would be an example, right? And you could simply read a lot of Blanchard, or you could read the Northouse text and put that, and he's very good about updating, so you can put the current flavor up against the older flavors and compare them. And for my money, having a good sense of that history, stepping outside the moral toolbox, it seems to me that a leader with a sense of history who can convey that sense of history is going to get much farther than the one who lacks it. And so and I realize I'm speaking like an academic theoretical guy, and I realize that what you're looking for are very practical tools, and I don't think these two are in conflict. I think, yeah, I think that being able to convey in a very practical way these theories is also a good leadership skill. That and to convince the subordinates that they stand to benefit, and not simply by getting a raise, but in life they stand to benefit from this effort. Everybody wins. So the quick reading is the North House book, I would say. It does marvelous. He's really worked very hard at bringing together the stuff that you need in one text.
And I think that would allow our listeners to pull the thread and find other stuff and dive deeper into.
Very much so. Yeah, because of the bibliography, for one thing. But also it's fun because it does contain these, almost every chapter has some sort of test that you can administer to yourself, sort of like the Myers-Briggs, that kind of thing. But each chapter has a test that matches to that kind of leadership, and it enables people to learn a little bit more about themselves and what their style is. So it does a very nice job of both being theoretical and practical. So that's my quick answer to your question, and it's a good question.
No, that was I'm satisfied. So, well, I just want to thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge. I think that has been an amazing talk by you, and I've personally learned a lot of stuff. So I love when I do these, and I feel personally curious because it's the process of, if you want, interviewing the subject is effortless. So I felt that way. So thank you so much, Chris. Thank you everybody who's been listening to us for the past hour or so. It was a pleasure, and I hope you all stick to the other keynotes and content of the Share conference. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. This was a real honor.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Be well.